I should say that one of the things that I found most interesting about your own work and your quadrant structures and so forth is this way that you're able to show how the realm of self and consciousness, as it were, the inner view of things, can correspond to external structures, including brain structures and so on that have evolved over time.
Exactly. And morphic fields.
Yes, exactly, which I think really depend on morphic fields.
Right.
But what I think you're doing, which I find tremendously congenial and fits with my own approach, is breaking down the extreme dualism that people have got used to, where you have a kind of mechanical, physical reality, and then you have a kind of supernatural world of minds, gods, free will, morality, the sort of Cartesian dualism that put all the realm of religion, angels, gods, imagination and stuff in a non-physical realm, and then everything else was in a physical realm.
Right.
And I think what's really happening now, and what I find is the most exciting thing going on intellectually at the moment, is through the expansion of science, through an enlarged view of science, no longer this cramped, mechanical, reductive kind of view. As we get a bigger view of science, then the kind of expansion of levels that you talk about in your hierarchies makes it possible to see how many of these phenomena traditionally considered either immaterial or spiritual or non-physical can actually be understood within an expanded science and integrated with it. And I think this is one of the most exciting things happening at the moment. And the greatest challenge that's actually acknowledged within science is the nature of consciousness. Having been ignored for decades, if not centuries, it's now a hot topic on the scientific agenda. And the more people have tried to explain it simply in terms of brain function, the more obvious it's become that that's not enough. And that something, that there really is a very deep problem here. And that means that these kinds of issues are now absolutely center stage in mainstream science. Not that your approach or mine is yet sort of the main thing, the way that people think is not. But the fact is that people are moving out of a reductive, mechanistic way of thinking, realizing there are serious problems here. They used to think in the 80s that artificial intelligence, you just create minds inside computers and it was all just a matter of algorithms and genetic information processing. Now, most mainstream psychology has moved on to recognize that minds are embodied. They have to do with actions in the world, that thought is influenced by emotion and stuff. Well, I mean, this is something that the average child has known, for years. But somehow this is a major breakthrough in science to recognize that minds are embodied, that they have qualities, subjective experiences. And so these are now things that are taken seriously within science. And that means, I think, that the debate within mainstream science is going to move more in the kind of direction that you've sketched out with your quadrants.
Yeah, one hopes, because what that does, the 4 quadrants, are just also a variation on first, second, and third person perspectives. And the idea is that as each occasion comes to be, it has a first, second, and third person dimension to it. And these are all irreducible. So what we get in consciousness studies today, of course, is a kind of a raging argument over which is real, first-person phenomenological accounts or third-person objective, traditionally scientific accounts. And my view is that both of those are, in a sense, equally real, that every dimension has an irreducible first-person dimension, a proto-I-ness, and every occasion has an objective third-person objective sort of scientific view, and that sort of goes all the way up, all the way down. And so what we're looking at here with morphic fields and morphic units is a sort of a third-person description, and something you would agree that many of the holons, if not all, have a first-person proto-I-ness to them. And so a holon would have both an exterior described as its form, its structure, its matter, its energy, and I add its field. These are all third-person items, objective things. And that can be said to exist in some sense. And then there's a subjective component that is first-person and can only be approached and described in first-person terms. So when we describe morphogenetic fields and so on, we are just acknowledging that we're taking an objective view of the situation and that there is a subjective, inherently embodied and inactive mind or proto-mind or consciousness or proto-consciousness that's in most, if not all, holons up and down the traditional great chain. And that's, in a sense, getting, indeed, the subjective, traditionally heavenly worlds to be embodied in earthly worlds. And specifically what we find, at least evolutionarily, is that the greater the degree of complexity of the material form, the greater the degree of consciousness that it can house or can be enacted by it. And that simply sort of just follows the evolutionary tree itself, down from very, very, very proto-sentience in quarks and atoms up to self-aware consciousness in mammals of the triune brain. But that does get these two together. It does get heaven and earth together for sure.
No, I think it's a wonderful way of looking at it, and the only one that in the end makes sense. And I've thought about the inner side of holons much less than you have. And,
right.
I mean, it makes a tremendous amount of sense to me, but I find it hard to imagine, if I start trying to think it through, would animals see colors the same way we do?
Right.
What would an atom or a crystal feel?
Right.
What would the kind of perceptive activity or prehension, as Whitehead called
right.
it, what would this be like?
Right.
And so that requires a kind of imaginative leap, which
right.
I find myself blundering around in and haven't really got very far with, but I'm a sort of beginner in this. So you've thought about it more than me. How do you actually think in terms of the inner life, as it were?
Right. Whitehead and those Leibniz and so on, who are panpsychists, in others who believe that some sort of mental activity is present in the lowest forms of existence, atoms, for example, tend to, in my opinion, sort of overqualify what's going on down there. And the only claim that I make is that there is an inside and an outside, and a singular and a plural of every form. And that basically, those are the four quadrants, the inside and the outside of a singular and a plural. And I just argue on logical grounds, it doesn't make sense to have outsides running around without insides to them. And it doesn't make sense that there's a singular without a plural. There are no first instances, which is another very interesting thing about emergence in evolution, is that whole groups seem to show up. You don't get, just the emergence of one male rabbit. And he's got to have the same number of things on the opposite to get one female rabbit. Emergence is a staggeringly complex thing, as you know, and you have thought about that part of it. But what I maintain is that Whitehead and others would maintain that there's no outsides without insides. I just add there's no singular without plural, and that gives us the four quadrants. It also happens to give us first, second, and third person pronouns, which sort of emboldens my own sense that every occasion has these three or four main dimensions, an I, we, and it, or first, second, and third person. And then what I usually say is you can take these four dimensions and push them down as far as you want. And that's where the argument occurs. In animal rights activists, it's how far down do feelings go? Well, shrimp. So above shrimp, you can't, kill them. Below shrimp, you can. The argument then is, well, no, you can push it all the way down into atoms. Atoms, Whitehead said, sort of rather famously, that physics is a study of small organisms, biology is a study of big organisms, and push it all the way down into atoms. I essentially am not arguing from a panpsychist view, but just from an inside and outside view, and that these four dimensions are certainly dimensions that we can look at anything through. And assigning a first-person dimension to a shrimp, for example, does indeed take a certain imagination. All I claim is that if it has an outside, it has an inside. And that I believe that there's actually a mutual resonance that is set up by interiors. And it's called mutual understanding with human beings, and is intersubjectivity. And so, for example, when a deer runs into another deer, it knows the difference between deer and fox, or deer and rabbit. There's an actual mutual exterior perception. Along with that goes a mutual interior resonance. And that resonance, again, is mutual understanding in human beings, is in part carried by a morphic field. And that's what we're resonating with. We're actually on the same wavelength. And I believe that, and this I actually get from Vedanta, that every interior state has an objective body. And that means every mental state has a bodily matter and energy. And therefore I would add form. And actually they're talked about often as fields, realms. So Nirmana Kaya, Sambhoga Kaya, Dharma Kaya. Kaya means both body, realm, and field. And what they maintain, and this works directly into your work, is that there are gross, subtle, and causal energies or bodies, and that every mental state requires a body to support it. So the waking state, and this is just phenomenologically, the waking state has a gross physical body. The dream state has a subtle body. You're not in the gross physical body. There's no gross nature at all. These subtle forms, images, luminosity, light, and so on. And that is a subtle body. And they maintain it to be real. That subtle body is the body, for example, that you migrate in reincarnation from birth to birth. And then there is a causal body, and that goes on with deep, formless sleep. So pure emptiness is itself supported by a very subtle body or causal body. And they maintain that these are actual energies. And so one of the possibilities of looking at morphic fields, and this is just speculative, of course, is that they are not sort of held in some timeless realm, but are actually transmitted by these energies. And they could all be transmitted by causal energies, but it would, first of all, it would fit the actual similarities that you use in describing formative causation, because usually you use, wavelength, and one string and one piano vibrates, the other string on a piano next to it begins to vibrate. These are all actually fields carried in space and time, actually carried in a material medium. And so it's at least a possibility that form is a morphic unit and itself has a consciousness component. And that could just be the memory component. Memory could be the whole definition of life, and therefore crystals have memory, and therefore crystals have that kind of interior, proto-interior. But myself, I generally leave it open for people for how far down they want to push the four quadrants. But I do say by the time you get to human beings, we have irreducibly four quadrants. And
I mean, the idea of pushing them right down is attractive to me. And memory, in our case, and also in the case of an atom or a protein, is mainly habitual, and habitual memories are mainly unconscious. You don't need to think about habits. They happen automatically. What consciousness seems to be concerned with is possibility, and where you've got to choose among possibilities.
Or break habit.
Break habits, or where you've got a conflict of habits, or something like that, where it's not going to just go along a groove of habits smoothly without any need to think. But as soon as there's a possibility of different things happening, different possibilities, then consciousness comes into play, and consciousness, as it were, inhabits a realm of possibility. And its role seems to be to sway things in one way or another among possibilities. But the only way that conscious decisions can be made between possibilities is to be able to hold different possibilities in consciousness. Therefore, it has to be a realm in which possibilities coexist.